This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 353, Web Components. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about web components with Ron Northcutt. Ron has also been involved with Drupal for a long time, since 4.6, and an Aquarian for over 7 years. Ron is a jack of all trades and currently working as the director of technical marketing at Acquia. You can hear Ron previously on episode 342. Ron, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Awesome to be here. Appreciate it.
I'm John Picozzi, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the second time. Donna Bungard, Senior Accessibility Program Manager for Marketing at Indeed. Donna, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, guys.
And Nick Laughlin, how are you, sir?
Very good. I'm super excited about this show. This is the most front end. I feel like this is where front end and back end really meet more than usual. So super excited to talk about web components.
I am going to throw up the rabbit hole alert when Nick gets really excited about a show. We tend to go down some rabbit holes. So brace yourselves, listeners. All right, let's jump into the module of the week, which I'm absolutely shocked that we have not done this one, because I think we've all used it from Ron may have used it as early as Drupal 4.6, according to his intro, but I think we've all used it in Drupal 7. Module of the week this week is menu block. So I'll let everybody chime in on this module, but basically it does exactly what the title of the module says that it does. It allows you to select a menu and then allows you to create a block from that menu. Really helpful, I found, I guess I should say, in creating subnavs or secondary navigations on pages, because you have the ability to select the parent item and then either show or hide that parent item and display it in a block. So can be super helpful.
Yeah, that's kind of the primary use case, because in core Drupal 9, Drupal 8, you can add a menu to a block on a page, but you can't specify parent only or starting at the third level. This module really is key when you have kind of a deep nav and you need to have contextual menus. It just makes it really easy to kind of in configuration make those changes and just drop it on the page somewhere.
Well, I was just going to say, way back when I was still doing the front end dev, I'd use it for a real quick gateway into creating a landing page, because I could exclude the menu from it and just add whatever I wanted there really quickly. So if I was tight for time, it was my first love for that.
Ron, what do you want to add?
I was just going to say there was a specific site I remember using it for back in Drupal 7. It was the Marfan Foundation. It's a nonprofit for people that suffer from Marfan syndrome. But the thing that we used it for is we had a very complex navigation structure with a lot of I think it went down 4, in some places maybe even 5 levels. And so what we were able to do is, by keeping the top level nav without any drop downs, we were able to, once you jumped into a section, that whole subsection with, path alias was able to show that piece of the menu nav down there. So we were using a single menu for the entire thing. But once you get into a section, as we talked about earlier, it was a perfect, clean solution. I was very pleased.
So now we've done menu block, and we can add it to the rolls of history. Let's jump into our primary topic. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for Nick to ask all of his burning questions. But I'm kind of new to this topic, so I'm going to ask the really super basic question to start off. Ron, what are native web components?
So in the browser spec, there are a few kind of APIs, platform APIs that you have available, and there are a few key ones that you can kind of use together to give you this functionality of like a web component. So a lot of people may think of a component as something like belonging to React or Angular or things like that. But the beautiful thing about this is that you don't actually need that external framework. So there's custom elements, which we can talk about a little bit. The Shadow DOM, which is kind of like an encapsulation of your styles and things. The ability to add modules in JavaScript, yes, and then templates and slots. And you can use some or all of those things to a certain degree to create web components. And the really fun thing is at the end of the day, you've got that web component and you can reuse it over and over again. And using some of these different strategies, you can make them, configurable, programmable, very, very cool, powerful, fun little things.
So go a little deeper with me. Tell us how web components differ from, say, custom elements.
Sure, yeah. So I actually started working with custom elements, and they can actually take you pretty far. So for folks who may not know, in HTML, of course, you have elements like a paragraph or an anchor or unordered list or something like that. So what the custom element spec allows you to do is to create your own elements that do not actually exist. So you could create a talking Drupal element. And you might say, I have a talking Drupal element and it has an attribute of episode. And so if I do talking Drupal episode, what's today? 353. 353. Then your custom element could then render like a little player or something with that specific episode. And so you can make all your own things. But the other cool thing about custom elements is you can extend regular elements. So I could extend a paragraph element. So I can make a talking Drupal paragraph element that does something specific. So when I put in my text, it might do something else or might filter or what have you. A web component is kind of bigger than that because you'll take that custom element that you have, and the web component, the web component allows you to use other APIs to kind of extend it out, whether you're going to use the Shadow DOM to kind of create more like a lockdown, almost like a micro front end. You can use the modules to kind of pull in different things or use things in different ways, or then obviously the templates and slots where you're going to really kind of make it more like a widget, if you will. So anything to add, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of the primary pieces of native web components, as I've seen them used, is that custom element piece. You're basically encapsulating your styles and your functionality into a custom container. So you can add whatever attributes you want. You can add whatever properties you want. And while it does require JavaScript, because it is based in JavaScript, it is native to all browsers at this point. So it's basically just HTML and JavaScript. You're not, so you're getting a lot of the flexibility and custom functionality that you can get with these frameworks without all the overhead of those frameworks. React can be, or Angular can be megabytes and megabytes of JavaScript that you have to download, and it contains the whole routing system. It contains a lot of stuff, whereas the native web component can literally be, the example that you almost always see when you're looking for tutorials and things are, like a counter or timer, that kind of thing. So you can have interactive functionality that isn't kind of the way that you normally work with JavaScript, where it's like find something on the page, do something with it, and kind of mash it to how you want. Like you're in a self-contained bubble essentially within that component.
So I've dumb guy questions. So an element is really just like an HTML tag, basically like a p tag,
Yeah.
input tag, button, whatever. Custom element is just like JavaScript that either builds its own element or modifies an existing element.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
You could, if I'm gonna make an analogy I haven't thought of until now, but maybe this will be good, maybe this will be horrible.
Oh, we
But
love first time analogies. Go.
okay, excellent. So if you think about Drupal and Drupal core modules, then you could sort of make that analogy to HTML with kind of the default tags, elements that come like the p tag, the input, the button. And then I have my contrib and custom modules that I'll layer on top that add additional functionality that didn't exist before. So a custom element would be kind of like that. Like the browser doesn't know about it. So it has to load the JavaScript, which defines this element that makes it available on the page. And then when it sees Talking Drupal, it's like, oh, I know what that is. I know how to render that.
So and sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but I'm trying to get
Nice.
a better understanding. So it takes that custom JavaScript and the browser has an API that says, okay, this is a custom element, and I'm going to use this. So then it uses that to interpret the HTML when you write your HTML code. Like, oh, when, if it were like HTML5 and you had like a video or an audio player, right, it would load that audio. Same deal with like our Talking Drupal custom element, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then bringing that back up to the web components, web component is really just a combination of custom elements and elements into like a component that you can use anywhere.
Yeah, to do whatever kind of crazy stuff you want to do. Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
And as an example, my website actually uses native web components, and I have one for TD episodes. So there's an element enlighten-td-episodes, and what it does is it takes the feed from YouTube and takes the most recent episode and just displays it on the page. So you can use it to even do kind of simple things like that. But the nice thing is it's encapsulated. The functionality is there. You can also work with some component libraries to kind of test things and make sure things stay the same. And then when you're deploying them on your site, they're encapsulated. You can be fairly confident that they're not going to change.
Well, and I liked, when you mentioned about HTML5, right? And so you think about something like the picture element or video or whatever, and you've got this great native functionality that didn't exist before. That's a standardization and an industry standard, but that same thing applies to what we're talking about here. So if I want to come up with my own thing, like for example, I started using these a lot with with Commerce Framework, which is kind of a reference architecture that we created. That's when I started going down that particular rabbit hole, because I was trying to create something that was reusable, so I could reuse it across a whole bunch of different things, that was following some common standards and patterns. And I wanted to build a library, but I didn't want to have a dependency on a specific framework. I didn't want to force people to use React or Angular. So that's how I ended up there. And then just the fact that it's natively supported, I'm a huge believer of trying to use what comes out of the box as much as you can, keep things simple. So
yeah, I mean, and that's one of the reasons why the project that I've talked about over the last few months is using it. One of their requirements was my client was hired to build a design system, and their client has thousands of websites across 10 or 15 different platforms: Drupal, Silverstripe, WordPress, Dreamweaver, like literal HTML sites. And the design system needed to be able to be integrated with all of those without a huge lift from their development team. And that's one of the only ways that you can do that as native web components. Otherwise, every development team is going to have to take, a typical design library says, like, here's some example HTML, here's some example styles, and then each development team has to then take that, find out how to fit that in their template, find out how to write the styles in a way that doesn't override other styles that they have on their site. And with native web components, really, they just have to, the integration point is get this JavaScript on the page and wrap your content in this HTML template. And if you do that, it will render, there's some caveats. If you do that in general, it will render exactly the way that it looks in the design library. there are some exceptions that we'll probably get to. So I do have another question for you, Ron, because as I'm, this, to be honest, this project that I've been working on is one of the first projects where I've used native web components extensively. I've used them in past, but it's always been either in conjunction with some library, some framework like React, or it's been kind of just proof of concept stuff, like how do you create a custom element type thing. And as I'm building this, I've been looking at some libraries, and I'm curious if you have used any of the top libraries that I find people mentioning, like Elix or Bit, Polymer, or Lit HTML. Are those native web component libraries that you've looked into? Are there others you'd recommend?
I played with Lit. It seems to be pretty popular. I have not used the others. I think the key there is just to make sure that you've got something that you can kind of standardize on, because they've all kind of got their pluses and minuses. There is another tangentially related library that I haven't had a chance to play with, but I'm very intrigued by, and it's called Mitosis, and it's from a company called Builder.io. And it's tangential because what this does is allows you to create your components kind of in their Mitosis framework, but then you can output that to it will render it as a React component, or as a Lit component, or as an Angular, or as a native, or as a Svelte, or as whatever.
Interesting.
It is. It's a really clever idea. I don't know how useful it is, but that is also something kind of fun to think about.
I'll have to look into that, because I'll be honest, I just discovered Bit yesterday, actually. And one of the reasons why I started looking into it was because it seems to have similar functionality. I dropped it because the install, like I started the install process, and it's like multiple gigabytes, and I'm like, why is this npm project to build native web components multiple gigabytes? It seems a little absurd, but I think a lot of it is tooling for building that.
The outputs.
But I will say I have used Elix, and it tends to be a little bit bigger than doing something natively yourself, but it's also somewhat plug and play. So for example, I was looking to, I spent probably a couple weeks on a personal project trying to build a carousel as a native web component, and kept running into weird behaviors or edge cases. And so I was like, okay, let me just try using Elix. Has a lot of carousels. So I'm like, let me try Elix. It took me 5 minutes to write in a custom native web component myself that just kind of builds on top of Elix. And it just kind of works. Now, like I said, it's a lot bigger. Building a carousel on the other project, it using like a Glide library or something added maybe 5 KB of space. Using the Elix one on that personal project added 250 KB or 200 KB. So it's significantly larger. But again, Elix is an extremely large open source library of components. So if you're even just thinking about doing web components and want to see like, hey, what kinds of things can be done, Elix is a great resource just to look at. Like if you want to see like calendar pop-ups or timers or carousels, it gives you a really broad range of projects that you can do in native web components.
I'm thinking of these libraries, I'm thinking of the accessibility of them. And if there's one that could be verified that are, I as an accessibility professional, I'm always going to, hold my breath a little bit with carousels. But in general, though, with these components, if there's ones that are already maybe not only compliant, but are really considering the user experience that isn't necessarily considered under the WCAG guidelines, there may be some fantastic opportunities there to bake accessibility into what's going on just by utilizing the work and streamlining what you're doing. It's a strategic win all around.
I'd say, actually, I'd love to pick your brain. I don't think this episode is necessarily the place to do this in detail, but on this project, I'd love to pick your brain on it, because and I love your opinion on this, Ron, too, but at a high level, you can make these accessible because they're just standard. It's standard HTML. Even though it's your custom HTML, you can do that.
Right.
We have run into a few edge cases, I think, due to the, I suspect it's due to the Shadow DOM, where it doesn't quite detect things on top of each other. So it can't detect contrast properly. But in general, because it's just natively supported functionality, accessibility is very achievable. Whereas a lot of these JavaScript library frameworks add so much stuff on top of it that it's a huge barrier to make them accessible. That being said, it does use JavaScript. So non-JavaScript applications are a major caveat.
Well, in general, though, there's also things to, it sounds to me like when you're talking about the native HTML versus the other things, you're talking a lot about assistive technologies and screen readers, which, first of all, hugely important. Visual barriers can be profound. That is only about 2% of the population of the 26% that identify as disabled. So we really need to think in terms of, motion impacts, ADHD, vestibular issues. Some people identify on the spectrum, some people who have or maybe English as their second language or low literacy, that speed, individuals who live with anxiety, things like that. There's a lot of other reasons that we need to consider beyond just that screen reader compatibility. But it's a fantastic first step into a larger strategy for sure.
You can also, one of the strategies that I like to look for to kind of help with some of these things is progressive enhancement. So like, for example, if we had, what we talked about earlier, the talking Drupal element, until the JavaScript loads to tell the browser what to do with that element, it's basically going to be ignored. So if you're not running JavaScript, or if you've got a slow connection or some other problem, it might be problematic. So one thing I try and look for ways to do progressive enhancement where I can add, typically by extending an element. So I'll give you a specific example. We recently rebuilt the developer portal at Acquia, so dev.acquia.com. Mm-hmm. And on all of the pages, there on the side of the page, there's a little blurb at the top about the author. And it takes the summary description of the author's profile page, and it displays it under a picture, but we're also making it sticky on the side. And so that's too big. So what we wanted to do was have that be basically collapsed down. So you see like the first two lines, and then there's a bit of a fade with the read more. So you can open and close it. Now, the original plan was we were just going to build that just, we tried using a library for that module, and it worked okay, but it didn't do what I wanted. It was a little too clunky. So we're going to make a custom web element, nice and simple. So we made the custom web element, but we extended the paragraph tag. So in the HTML, in the markup, it's P and then is equals, I think it was fade read more. Okay. And so what that told the browser was, hey, look for this. This is a custom element called fade read more. But that extends the P tag. So when the page loads, and if you don't load any JavaScript or the JavaScript's slow, the paragraph tag is still going to be rendered as normal. It's just going to be a normal P tag. But then once the JavaScript is loaded, once the browser sees it, it will then reinstantiate, and then it does the little fade, and it drops it down again. And so there's some things you can do with that kind. Yeah.
I would, actually I can see some applications for that for sure. So yeah, I'm actually gonna have to look into that, because most of the web components that we do have to be like custom, but I wonder if we can convert a couple of them to be just extensions.
I'm a big fan of that approach, that progressive enhancement, because you can also do some things like, for example, that particular component we also extended so you can program it with attributes that tell you how tall it should be and what the label should be, if it's read more or expand me or whatever it is. So it has defaults, you can program it so you can reuse it, but you could do things straight out of the box, for example, so that visually you're only showing and you're clipping it. So the text is all there. So screen reader can still access it. Visually, it's kind of what you want. It doesn't have all the functionality you want until JavaScript runs. But that's that kind of idea of progressive enhancement. Let's try and provide a solid foundation that works for everybody. And then let's add additional stuff on top to make sure we can kind of give a more app-like experience.
The only warning I'd say with something like that is to keep in mind that some screen reader users are visual users. So if somebody is looking at your screen and having it read text that they haven't clicked on, that might be a confusing user experience. So that's just something to keep in mind. Typically, screen readers that are designed for different disabilities may or may not interpret it the same way, but it's something just to think about when you're going through it.
Would that be a place where you use something like an area, something to kind of let it know that it was collapsed or it was, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, an ARIA label might, an ARIA expand or something might be. I'd have to work through this.
Yeah.
Not the time. We could go down an entirely another hallway with that. Can I actually just jump in real quick and ask a question? I keep hearing the phrase Shadow DOM, and I've been out of this a while, the developer side. What is that?
You want to take that, Ron?
Sure. So Shadow DOM is, you can almost kind of think of it like an iframe. It's not an iframe. It's not loading an external site, but basically, it's like you have this little box. And the box is inside the page and you have your DOM inside there, but it can also have its own styles. So the simplest way to say it is if I've got styles on my page that turn all of my paragraphs to purple, anything inside the Shadow DOM is not going to be purple. The p tags won't be purple unless I add the CSS there. So it's a way to kind of separate, separate the styling and what's going on inside that box and kind of encapsulate it away. That's why, like as Nick was saying, you can do things like, sometimes it can be really difficult. Let's say you put a button or something on and you want it to look a certain way or do a certain thing. And then you put it on one page and it breaks because the styles are doing something weird with the specific button. You're like, man, I didn't intend for that to happen. Now I got to go and undo this thing or do a not. So this allows you to kind of like really kind of dial in inside the component. If I'm using the Shadow DOM, which you don't have to, anything inside that is going to be encapsulated.
And it encapsulates both ways. So if you're using the Shadow DOM, whatever site it's on, the parent styles won't leak into your native web component.
Right.
And the styles in your Shadow DOM won't leak to the parent website. So it's both ways.
So this is a way to encapsulate it. It actually doesn't impact the DOM or the reading order. So again, I am thinking of that screen reader technology or those reader technologies that read the DOM and not the visuals. It's an encapsulation. It's basically putting up little puppy fences everywhere instead of actually rerouting somebody. Okay.
There are two exceptions to that. One, and this is starting, we're moving ahead a little bit, which is fine. But there are two exceptions. One is slots. Slots technically are physically in a different location, but they're referenced from the Shadow DOM. We'll get to what slots are in a bit. But I think the way that they're spec'd, they're treated as if they're in that order. So functionally, they're in a different location, but for screen reader, they're not. And then the second thing, the other exception is there are three things that do pierce, what's called pierce the Shadow DOM. So fonts that are in the parent are accessible to the Shadow DOM. Custom CSS elements, what most people call CSS variables, that are set on the parent website are accessible to the Shadow DOM. And I can never remember the third thing because it's never used. But there is one other thing that will pierce the Shadow DOM. And Ron, I don't know if you remember off the top of your head what that is.
It sounds so gothic, I've got to tell you. We're piercing the Shadow DOM.
I know, right?
Is that encapsulation like a security metric too? Like, is information from one to the other not shared? Like if you had, I don't know, stats or numbers or some sort of information in your web
Yes
component in the Shadow
yes and
DOM?
no.
Yes
So
and
for
no. Okay.
example, so for example, it is ultimately the information is on the page. So if you really want to, you can use JavaScript to get that information in there and affect it. So I mean, it is HTML, so you can get in there if you really, really want to do non-standard things with JavaScript. So that's one caveat. But in general, for example, if you have a menu that uses the Shadow DOM, for example, by default, Google isn't going to see you clicking on those items. Now, Google would see that you got to the destination page, but if you have analytics on the page, it's not going to see that click event unless you do some work to expose that event to Google. But if you use slots and the menu is actually in the light DOM, then Google natively is going to see all those click events the way that it normally would. So there are some considerations when you're looking at other things interacting with your native web components. There are things to consider.
So I have another. I don't know. Maybe it's not a dumb guy question, but I think it might be a dumb guy question because we're gonna mix two things and see what happens. So we're talking about native web components. I'm wondering how they differ from progressive web apps, and I mean I know what each of those things are now, thanks to you, Ron. But what can you use a native web component in a progressive web app? So first question, how do they differ? Second question, can progressive web apps contain native web components?
Sure. So just to set the stage for folks who may not be aware or have heard, PWA, a progressive web app, basically that's a process where you're just going to be taking the standard stuff, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and you're kind of starting to use some functionality that's built into browsers now to allow you to get what we might consider more native app type of functionality. So simple things like the ability to work offline, to preload things into the cache locally, to be able to, if you've ever seen an app like Spotify or I don't know if Twitter still does, where you can like save to desktop or save to your home screen, those kind of things. They use JavaScript workers in the background. So that's kind of what a PWA is. And then if you're going to be using a native web component, you can use it just like any other element. It's just HTML and JavaScript at the end of the day. So there's no incompatibility. However, I would say that there are some very interesting possibilities when you start to blend the two things together. So for example, as I mentioned, you've got, and there's a great module in Drupal, maybe it should be a module of the week at some point, the PWA module, which is lovely because it's simple and you just turn it on, it just works and you can extend it. And it allows you to do the same thing where you can kind of, save this as an app. So like I've done that on my phone. I've got a couple of sites that are using PWAs, and it's just the icon on my phone. I push it and it opens it up, and it's a browser, but there's no Chrome around it, so it looks like an app. But the cool thing about that is that you can do things like it's caching a lot of the data. So if I turn off my connection, go into airplane mode, I can still go browse through the site and do things and potentially interact with the site and have it catch up later when it makes a connection. That's kind of the holy grail. But the reason I mention that is because there's some really interesting ideas about things that you can do if you were going to be creating some of your own web components or using some out there that interact with those workers. So for example, to do a form, like to leave a comment that was going to kind of only live on my local while I'm offline and then catch up and post to the site later once I have a connection, that might be much easier to do as a component because I could just do it in one place and then reuse that over and over and over again for all types of things. So that could be interesting. Or like we talked about earlier, you could extend the form element to be like an offline form. I don't know if I'm sure someone's done that. That would just follow certain standards and have whatever limitations, but then you could use it for different things, for like liking or following or commenting, whatever.
Do you know of a native web component library for progressive web apps? Because it sounds like you could very easily create a native web component that you could use in a progressive web app or use as the kind of the service backend to operate.
I don't off the top of my head, but my goodness, wouldn't that be a cool thing to have something that was like we could make a module that depended on the PWA module and provided, an integration for flag, for comments, for all of those fun things. Somebody should do that.
If you create that, I'll take one creation credit there, or half a creation credit, I guess.
Half a credit, inspired by.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So what is the benefit of these native web components over, say, some framework specific ones? And I'm thinking where we're talking about a potential library, I'm going to get my answer along those lines, but
yeah,
I want to hear your thoughts, your words.
Well, my opinion, right or wrong, because they're not perfect, there's pluses and minuses, but my opinion is that I prefer keeping things simple. So the fact that I don't necessarily need a framework means that there's less weight to the page, there's less complexity. That's a big one. It's one of the reasons why I'm kind of a fan of frameworks like Svelte or Solid that render out to native JavaScript, because what you end up with is what I'm kind of going for. The other cool thing is that you can use them and reuse them regardless of framework. So if we created the talking Drupal web component today, then you could use it in a React app. You could use it in Angular. You could use it in Vue.js, over and over again, and there's no real major problems. And then I think we're going to see more of this kind of, as we see more of the expansion of the native browser functionality. Like I'm really interested in, the assembly, WebAssembly. I saw a thing, it's called Bit something, basically lets you run Node.js with an IDE in your browser as a native web component. So these are like groundbreaking kind of things, but web components used to be groundbreaking and now they're standard. So the idea of kind of building on what's already built into the common framework is just a pattern that I prefer, but
So when you're looking at requirements or building something, what kind of makes you think this is a good use case for web components? Because like you said, there's some limitations. There's some things, like for example, I generally wouldn't recommend using a native web component for like full page layout stuff.
Right.
I think that, I mean, you could, but I usually wouldn't consider using it for like full page layout. Like, is there a sidebar? Is there not a sidebar? Where that kind of stuff goes. It's a little bit more granular than that. What kinds of things tell you like, hey, this would be a perfect for web components, and this kind of excludes it from, being a web component?
So I did a report with O'Reilly a little while ago on, it's not very long, but it was on this concept of creating the virtuous cycle in your projects. And I kind of came up with this thinking about resources, and there's kind of like this inverse relationship. So for the developer, developer time is the most valuable thing. For the end user, though, developer time is honestly kind of meaningless. They don't care how long it took you to get there. They just want what they want. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got like how long it takes to download and process and deliver the page, which for the end user is critically important, right? And they want it to be as small of a payload as possible, as low loading time as possible, like near instant. Technically, even though that's not really how we think, but objectively for the developer doesn't necessarily have to care about that. It's like, hey, I delivered you the functionality and you can do whatever. So I like to think about it from both sides. So from the user perspective, I want to keep the payload as small as possible. So I want to keep JavaScript as small as possible. I don't want to use frameworks unless I have to. I want to rely on native stuff as much as I can. I want to keep CSS small, et cetera, et cetera. And when you start adding native web components, now you're adding to the potential weight of the page. The trade-off there is that if you need or want that type of functionality, it could be a heck of a lot more efficient than something like React, as we pointed out.
Yeah.
On the other side, though, from the developer experience, one of the things that these components can do, especially on the front end, is they can encapsulate a lot of that reusable functionality and make it much faster and much easier to do things. So there's always going to be a trade-off. So for me, when I think about it, I tend to think more from like the atomic level up. So thinking about the specific atoms that compose a page and then the specific components that compose a page, and looking at places where is there functionality that if I encapsulate, or if I'm going to use a micro front end like with the Shadow DOM, that's going to provide value to the end user who's receiving it. That's going to be more points in favor of. And then what does that mean for the developer experience? Is that going to increase it? Is that going to make us faster? Is that going to enable us to focus on doing work on one thing that's used 10,000 times? Well, heck, then that's going to give me a lot of value, which means I can roll things out faster for my users. Yeah. So that's kind of where I start looking. And then once I start getting into the page, it's typically around things like more advanced interactions, more app-like functionality. That's where you start to ask those questions like, okay, does it make sense to do this here? Although then there's also the question of, do we need that app-like functionality? Do we really need that carousel? But, then you get there.
So what are life cycle callbacks and how would one use them?
Very good question. So as we mentioned kind of earlier, when you have a web component, the browser doesn't know it exists at first, right? The browser is loading the page. It knows what the default HTML spec is, but it doesn't know about this custom stuff that you kind of use these hooks to put in place. So, but because of the API, it has this ability to discover and then render them. But then sometimes they change, right? Like if you have a counter and the counter's going up, you want to potentially know when that happens, events. Yeah. Or sometimes things go away. So there's a life cycle that's associated with the components. It's kind of like hooks in Drupal, right? So you know when something is created, when something's updated, when something's destroyed, and you can use those to kind of listen for things or inject certain things or issue events to let other components know something happened so they can be listening, etc. I did find one, I don't remember off the top of my head, it was in that commerce reference I mentioned, but there was something very specific that was really driving me nuts with this component I was trying to do, because it was trying to build the component and it was looking to register, I think it was a callback or something, but that library hadn't been loaded yet. And so sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So I used the lifecycle function. And so basically I waited until everything was loaded and this was completely fully loaded. And then in that part of the cycle, I was able to add the piece I wanted. So.
And it's important to note, for example, some of them are really, like, not all of them are really important, but for example, when you create a native web component, you can determine what attributes are on there. Like an attribute might be what color is it or something like that. Attributes aren't available in the constructor method when you're creating it. Attributes are only available after the what's called the connected callback. So you need to kind of know where to do things. Speaking of which, that's one of the I'm curious if you know how this happens actually, Ron. Storybook does something that breaks the lifecycle callbacks, or maybe doesn't break, maybe smooth the lifecycle callbacks in native web components. For example, like I said, attributes just are not available to a native web component until a connected callback. But if you have a native web component in Storybook and you do something with an attribute in the constructor, it'll work. But then as soon as you try to integrate that in a real site, your component will work.
Working all of a sudden.
Yeah, because the attributes aren't available at that point. I'm just curious. Do you know what story? I've not been able to find out what the heck Storybook is doing to do that, but I assume it's some React magic on the back end that just forces them to reload. But
that would be my guess, because there is a module that I like to use called the component singular, the component module, and it allows you to add web components into Drupal, and they can be rendered as libraries or as blocks. The reason I mention this is because if you add a form, which is just in the YAML and is passed up to the block, you can configure what the attributes should be. But because Drupal doesn't know about the web component, the attributes are passed through as a wrapper around the web component. So you have to go to the parent to get them if you want to pull them in. But I can go to the parent to get them in the constructor because they're already output on the page.
Yeah, because they're in the DOM.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if versus the shadow DOM, and we're not piercing the shadow DOM and invoking the Necronomicon or whatever. Yeah. So I'm wondering if maybe Storybook is doing something kind of like that. It already knows that those things are there, so it's kind of keeping it there for fast reloading and what have you. But just a guess. I haven't really used Storybook much.
I assume. So one of the things that also kind of trips up new users or new web component builders is styles. Where do your styles go when you're creating a native web component?
So I'm probably a little bit different because I'm not a native, front end person, a back end person that's learned some front end stuff. So as we talked about, you can use the shadow DOM and you can include styles that are just encapsulated there. Personally, I try to avoid doing that unless I really need to. I want my components to be as generic and vanilla as possible and play nicely with wherever they live, because I want to be able to reuse them and not put them in. But yeah, that's where you have the choice, right? You can either do it inside the shadow DOM where it's going to be encapsulated in part of it, which totally makes sense if for things for positioning, or if you have specific things that are maybe not necessarily so much about styles like colors maybe, but more about how things are displayed or how things work, or if there's a display none until you click on something, those types of things. You definitely would want to encapsulate that because you don't want it to affect other things. But otherwise, I try and be as friendly as I can with whatever the parent page is, and just allow that to cascade. Yeah.
So I get kind of an overall question here, because I'm getting it as you guys are talking, which is awesome, but I'm also trying to figure out Nick's question of where do the styles go, right? And my question of where does the HTML go? I guess I'm trying to figure out there's two parts to this, right? My component and the JavaScript and the HTML that kind of run my component, right? And then there's my page that I'm building. And I'm wondering how you kind of wire that all up. Where does the native web component live in reference to your page and a page that might be calling it, right? So is it something for example, we'll because this is a Drupal podcast, we'll bring everything comes back to Drupal, but is it is it something where there's a certain folder structure in your web root that a browser just kind of understands and says, hey, there's a modules contrib folder, and it has, or a native web component folder that I can pull all these components in from? Or is it something that you're just basically calling it at the top of your page as a call out to JavaScript, and then the browser's kind of interpreting that and doing its thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's how do you choose to organize and load the files onto the page? I mean, I can, again, my opinion, the way I like to do it, because I started with Drupal and I'm kind of backed into the front end, is I use that the component module. It was specifically created for this purpose because it hooks into Drupal, and those JavaScript files, the CSS files, and things that I need are added as libraries in Drupal. For each of my components in the YAML, I define whatever dependencies there are. So Drupal will take care of loading my dependencies. It'll take care of aggregation, getting the stuff on the page where I want it. And at that point, I think about it like you can create one-off components, and you can go to like webcomponents.org, for example, and there's tons and tons of them. And there's some for Lit and Bit and all those other ones. You can go grab them, and that's great. But I tend to think of it in terms of like a package, like a library of components that hopefully have some shared dependencies, that hopefully have know how to work together and interact together, and that's where your functionality comes from. And that's the point where I think, again, from a Drupal perspective, which is going to be different than a straight JavaScript app. In a straight JavaScript app, you're going to be calling or including those like as ES modules or loading up specific functions. But in Drupal, you don't necessarily know where the file's going to live. And so it's really hard beforehand, unless you're very opinionated, to say, oh yeah, I know that I'm going to load this library because it's loaded here, and now I can do that in JavaScript. Versus with Drupal, people put things in different places. So that's why I like to use the library system to help me manage it. And then once it's on the page, I just use it as I want.
So going back to like just basic HTML, right? Like, so it's basically just loading JavaScript, and then it's the browser is kind of using its API to figure out where things are.
Well, yeah, but there's an important distinction too, actually, because there's kind of two levels to this. What you guys are talking about right now is kind of on the integration side, right? So on the integration side, you already have a native web component, and you're basically telling Drupal I don't know how you would do it without using the library system. That'd be kind of bizarre not to, but you're basically telling the library system, this is the JavaScript for this library. Then you have a Twig file somewhere that says, okay, when you're rendering this piece of content or this paragraph or this whatever, you attach this library to it, which then Drupal uses to attach the JavaScript, and then output this HTML. And that HTML is the custom element that you created with attributes placed where they're supposed to go. So that's the integration side. You're basically telling Drupal when this thing, like the way you normally do with Twig integrations, when this Twig template needs to load, you need this JavaScript library, and this is the HTML you're outputting. But on the native web component side, you're also defining HTML structure and styles for the shadow DOM. So in a simple case, let's say you have a custom element where you're passing in a color and some text, right? You might have your shadow DOM structure might have, a span that takes the color, and then a p tag internally that takes the text and inserts it, right? So you can define the internal structure of your native web component separately from the native web component itself. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that. I mean, the most basic examples are just inline. Your styles are inline in the JS file. Your template is inline in the JS file. But if you're using build tools, you can kind of separate those into separate files.
And that's where the template and the slots piece start to fit in.
I was gonna say, we're talking about Shadow DOM again. I'm wondering, before you said something about slots, what are those? How are they used? I'm sorry, I'm still catching up on some of this piece of it.
Yep. Well, this is this is dark magic, like no question, right? So
no.
Awesome. So the template is actually an HTML element now. And so you can actually put it in JavaScript, you can actually put it in HTML, and it just kind of gives you that structure that then JavaScript can grab and use. It's a framework. And then slots are another one, and slot is kind of like a place. You can almost kind of think about like a region in Drupal, but it's more specific. Where you can, it's a placeholder. It's like, okay, I have a slot here and I'm going to put stuff into it later. I don't even necessarily know what it's going to be. I just know I've created a component, I put a slot, I've got some ideas about how it should be used. But then when I give it to you, you're going to take it and you're going to be able to say, okay, well, Ron was using it and he was putting this stuff into this slot. But I'm going to use the same thing. I'm going to put different stuff in there. And depending on how the component was created, it may be very specific or it may be very general, in which case you put whatever you want. So it makes things a little bit more reusable.
Oh, that's awesome.
So a couple of specific examples of how we've used slots, because there's kind of two different types. There's what's called named slots and there's anonymous slots. So for example, we have a component that we call grid. And this is one of those examples where it actually is kind of layout, even though usually you don't do layout with this. So we have a component called grid and we have an anonymous slot. And basically that all the grid component does is you can pass one attribute that says columns, like should it be 2, 3, or 4 columns. And then there might be, there's an attribute like, do you want break lines between the rows? So if you say 3 column, you give 6 items, do you want an HR between them, right? So those are the 2 attributes. Then we have an anonymous slot. And so the anonymous slot basically says anything that's within me, put it here in order. So then the person, they can put whatever cards they want in there. They can put in other custom components. They can put images. They can put text. They can put whatever they want in there. It's just going to basically put it inside the component. And it will say, okay, I'm supposed to be 3 columns, and it'll push it into 3 columns, right? The other thing you can do is say a name slot. Say you have more than one slot that you need to assign to different areas of your native web component. A good example is an eyebrow. So let's say you have a little eyebrow that, a little bit of text with a tag on it or something, and you need that to go between the image and the description, right? So you say this slot, the name is eyebrow. And then when you're rendering that, you can basically say, hey, this is the eyebrow piece, and the native web component will put that there. And then maybe you have a CTA slot. So at the bottom of that, you have a CTA. So you have a slot that's named CTA, it's going to push it in that CTA section. So like Ron said, it's a way to take content that's internal to the component and just put it there. And it's great because, again, this is kind of a technical detail, but it's great because that slotted content technically is light DOM, which means that it can be styled by the parent website. So if you were doing it with something like a grid, you can say, hey, this is a grid. This is how it will get handled. It'll handle all the automatic like reshuffling and stuff and responsiveness. You can style it however you want it, put whatever you want in there, and this component will lay it out properly.
Because you can pierce the shadow DOM with the slot.
Yeah,
there's no piercing because it's the slot.
Right, because it's just that.
It's in the light DOM.
And that's a good way, it sounds like, to make sure you have headers on all of your grids and all of that good stuff too.
Yep. So that's interesting too, because then you could have like, let's say you had like your grid example, and you have like a title for that grid component. So it's like, upcoming events or something. And you could style that a specific way just because it's like, it's a heading. But then if you were pulling inside the slot, whatever those other cards were, those wouldn't necessarily interfere or be interfered with by the CSS inside that shadow DOM, because they're still pulling from the light DOM.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the reasons why you might want to do this is, in our case, is you can do things that aren't really well supported yet in browsers, but because you're inside of something, you can control that really well. So for example, one of the things that this project did with like these grids is we introduced container queries. So basically, everybody on the call is familiar with responsive design, right? You kind of respond to the width of the viewport, and sometimes you respond to the behavior, like is it a touch device or not? But in our particular case, we can't rely on that because we don't know. We're going to provide training and guidelines and things like that, but we don't know for sure that a developer is putting this grid in a full width layout. They might be putting it in a layout that has a sidebar, or they might even just be putting it in the sidebar for some reason. So we have mobile designs that look great. I mean, it's a mobile first project, so it would actually look great in that sidebar, but we can't depend on the width of the viewport because it's now been squished into something that's 250 pixels wide. We need it to display the mobile layout at that width. So we were able to, because it's a native web component, pretty easily have it determine the width of its container and apply the correct styles based on the width of the container rather than the width of the device that is being viewed on. Which means that if they put it on something that has weird padding that we're not expecting, or in a layout that's not expecting, we can be confident that it's going to look good because it's responding to its parent container's width, not the width of the viewport. Okay, so we are getting towards the end of the show. I'm curious, now that we've gone through all this, we've dove deep. This has been a bit more technical than most of our shows. Our listeners are probably somewhat excited about them and maybe a little intimidated. I guess one of the questions is, are these well supported? Are they something that people should look into?
Pretty much, yes. And you can go and look up for any specific things you're trying to do, but generally speaking, except for IE, rest in peace, you can pretty much at this point rely on all of this functionality. I think as you point out, though, there are you might run into some weird edge cases. We are kind of dealing with some strange things. So there may be some places where you have assumptions about how things should work that they may not. And there may be some edge cases where
Safari.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't want to say it, but where things don't quite work maybe the way they should. But generally speaking, yeah, I would not shy away at all. Definitely something fun to use.
So webcomponents.org has a table that shows support, and all the major browsers, even Safari, do have stable support for HTML templates, custom elements, Shadow DOM, ES modules. Yeah. So Safari's wonkiness could just be
the way sometimes the way they implement those things.
So Safari's the new IE. They
Shots fired.
Whoa. As a backend developer who has very little front end, I've been hearing that through the grapevine.
That's it. That's the last time you'll see our podcast on Apple Podcasts. It's all done.
That's fantastic.
So, in wrapping things up here, Ron, is there anything else that we should cover that maybe our listeners should know about? I will say before you answer that, the last 5 minutes I have lost myself on webcomponents.org and found a funny little component library from Adobe called the Spectrum Web Component Library, and I don't know, it looks pretty easy to implement and to start using. They have interesting like tooltip component and a bunch of different things. So anyway, getting back to the question, anything else our listeners need to know that we did not cover?
So I think we have covered a lot of this stuff. The one thing I would say is don't be intimidated, because I think one of the challenges I've seen is that there are a lot of people who are traditionally back-end developers, myself included, who don't know as much about the front end. They don't know as much about semantic HTML or accessibility or how these pieces fit or the latest and greatest JavaScript frameworks. And it's just a whole other thing they don't think about. On the other side of the table, you have, front-end people who know, typically they don't even want to know about Drupal or about PHP or about how those things work. And the middle ground between where they meet, I think, is an area where we as a community need to do more looking and more investing. It's not as scary or confusing or complex as it used to be. So like on the very, very easy side, there's a module called Web Components, I believe, that I think will actually allow you to pull in pieces directly from webcomponents.org. So super easy to use there. I've mentioned the component module a number of times. There are other modules that are very similar, that offer similar functionality, that basically it's a very easy way to allow you to take web components and get them into Drupal and use them in Drupal as a site builder without having to create like plugins or library files, or, so if someone leans more, on the JavaScript side and they don't want to touch that gross PHP stuff, this is a way for them to do that. But also, if you're a Drupal developer on the back end and you want to start dabbling, it's a really, really easy way for you to jump in. And I've seen even less experienced, like sales engineers and people who don't have a PHP developer background, jump in and be able to be, okay, I can go grab something from, CodePen, or I can play around with some sample code. And here's a really quick and easy way for me to get it into a Drupal site and start playing around with it. Yep. So highly recommend start playing with this stuff if you haven't. A lot of value and a lot of cool features that you can do.
Very cool. Well, Ron, thank you for joining us. It was great talking with you as always, and look forward to having you on again.
Anytime. Just know if you find me on, I'll just keep talking. So good job on y'all for reining me in. That's a pro move on that one.
For our listeners, do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel. And if you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, you can sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron.
All right, we've gotten to the end of our show. Ron, if folks wanted to chat your ear off about native web components, how could they go about doing that?
Typically, it's RL Northcutt, NORTHC2T, in all the places. So Twitter and definitely Drupal.org. And I'm around and about. I'm in Drupal Slack community events. Come find me. Tell me what you like. Tell me what I got wrong. Tell me how to make it better.
Awesome. Donna, what about you?
On LinkedIn or in Drupal Slack, I'm Donna Bungard. On Twitter or most other places, I'm D Bungard. So reach out.
Awesome. Nick Laughlin.
You can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.